Hi friends, a very good evening and thank you for joining in. Could you just confirm if I'm visible and audible in the chat window?
I'm visible and audible.
Okay, I can see myself in the chat window. So I can also hear myself. If everything is good, we'll get started as usual. Probably we'll wait for a few minutes for everyone to join in before we jump into the crux of a discussion. Good. Thank you very much, folks. Thank you for joining today. Let's wait for some more time because I think most of us are 5 minutes early as usual. So we'll wait for everyone to join in over the next 5 to 8 minutes and we'll get into the discussion shortly. We would recommend, as we have put in the chat window here, we request you to put your questions in the chat window. We will try and do our best to collate these questions if there is a flood of questions and answer as many general patterns of questions that we observe. We've also made a note of typical questions that students have asked in the announcement video's comment section, and we'll also try and answer as many of those as possible. Again, the purpose of this video, just to be clear here, is to discuss typical career transition paths that we observe for people going from various education and career paths to careers in data science, machine learning, etc. Right? So any question related to that, we are happy to answer. Cool. So seems like things are going good, no glitches whatsoever. Okay. Good. So I'll wait for some more time. Again, let's wait for everyone to join in so that we can have a good session which is beneficial to everyone. So while others join in, right, while we go into the core of the discussion, I'll take some general questions from the chat window. So SDE to machine learning transition, what's the difference in the working of two? So this is from somebody whose alias is Stallion97. So fundamentally speaking, a software engineer's responsibility or a software development engineer's responsibility is to build software, whether it's a distributed system software, whether it's a app-based software, web-based software, desktop software, whatever it is. Their job is to use standard techniques in typical computer science to build the solution that is needed in whichever framework, whichever system they are working on. So their work involves mostly programming, a little bit of data structures, algorithms, a little bit of concepts from operating systems, maybe some concepts from databases. Again, if you're working in a large internet company, maybe some distributed systems. Again, it depends a lot on what you're building the software on. If it's a mobile app, you'll have to look at some code optimizations for mobile apps. If you're building for web apps, you have to think of scale and latency and other issues. So it's mostly software engineering related. On the other hand, of course, there's a lot of system design, there's a lot of object-oriented design and concepts like that, which are important to software development engineer roles. On the other hand, typical machine learning stuff in terms of working, again, depends a lot on the role, depends a lot on the team. It could involve everything from doing data analysis, statistical modeling, all the machine learning math, sometimes deep learning, also deploying the models into production. If you're joining as a machine learning engineer, then most likely it will be building machine learning systems on the production end of things, right? So that's a fundamental difference between both. Again, as we often say, you can be a very successful software engineer. Similarly, you can be a very successful machine learning engineer or a machine learning scientist, right? At the end of the day, whatever you pick, become excellent at it, and that's what matters in the long run, right? So I'll talk about the transition from software engineer to machine learning in just a while because there are multiple sub-cases in that. Whether you're working at a top product-based company, whether you're working in a services company, whether you're working in a startup, and whether your experience is 2 to 3 years or 5 years or 10 years, right? So there is a huge spectrum there. I'll cover all those cases when we start the session itself, post 7 p.m. Okay, cool. Okay. Okay, so cool. There are some interesting questions. Anyway, while others join in, let me answer some standard questions. So somebody who has about 12 plus years experience in data warehousing and development, right? What could be their career path into data science? Again, somebody who has about 12 years of experience in databases or data warehousing typically, right? They're probably doing a lot of data management or data pre-processing, data storage, querying and all these things, right? So for somebody like them, for anybody with 10 plus years of experience, especially people with the data warehousing background, a logical path, right? Again, I'm just answering general questions, but I'll go into the exact, I'll try and break down all the specific details and go into it in a few minutes. But for this specific question, so again, data warehousing is slowly moving into the Spark world, into the NoSQL world. So if you can, because you're already sitting on data, if you can build machine learning systems as part of your current role. So for folks who already have 10 plus years of experience to transition into careers into data science and machine learning, a typical path will look like this. That you start working on a data science, probably a small module. It could be simple data analysis, it could be some machine learning, or it could be data pre-processing pipelines using distributed systems or using data warehousing stuff. So it will typically start with you working in your current role on some of these projects. And that will give you the expertise to showcase to external recruiters that yes, in addition to your deep expertise in data warehousing, you can also do data analysis, probably some machine learning, using distributed systems and using data warehousing like tools. Right? That's a typical career path that we see, that you go from a data warehousing person to somebody like sometimes a data engineering role, but you can also get into a data analyst or even a data scientist role where there is a lot of requirement of processing large amounts of data, typically hundreds of terabytes or even petabytes of data, right? So that's a more logical transition because it's a natural extension to all the data warehousing work that you have done, right? So just accept that in addition to just thinking of storage, querying and things like that, you're also doing efficient processing of data, efficient modeling of data, coming up with insights from the data, building probably some machine learning models and things like that. That's a more graceful transition from somebody with 12 years of experience in data warehousing to folks again, you have to start working in your current role on some projects, either for the client or for the company you're working for, or on your own, right? Again, I will come back to these candidates who have 10 plus years of work experience. So since it's 7:02, let's dive into various categories of questions that we have gotten. I'll get into the specifics a little later, right? I also see some questions of people saying, hey, I'm from so-and-so engineering background, I have this much experience and things like that. I will come to that. But first and foremost, let's break things down, right? So I'll give you some general guidelines which will answer most of your questions, if not all the questions, but that should answer like 90% of your queries. Rest of the 10%, I'll try to take them from the chat window. So first and foremost is, imagine if you're a fresher. We'll start from freshers to people with like 10, 15 years of experience, right? So imagine you're a fresher. Again, freshers can come in all shapes and sizes. You could have a 4-year engineering degree, or you could have a 3-year bachelor's degree, or you could have a 3-year bachelor's degree plus a 2 years master's degree. First, let's take the case of a 4-year bachelor's engineering degree. Within that, again, there are two categories, right? You have engineering students from CS background and non-CS background, mechanical engineering, civil engineering, etc. When I say freshers, I mean all the students with less than 2 years of experience. Typically, anybody who's just going to graduate, probably in the final year, to somebody with less than 2 years of experience. That's what I would call as sort of like a fresher. So for these people, if you're coming from a smaller engineering college where you don't have great placements, again, that's what a large chunk of students would be, your most realistic path to data science would be, again, I'm not saying every student will follow this path. There will always be exceptions to this rule. But this is the transition paths that we typically see for freshers, smaller engineering colleges, CS background, right? First, let's tackle this case. Then we'll tackle other cases also. So freshers, CS background, smaller engineering colleges, most likely, if you want to build a career in data science, obviously you have to learn all the stuff that, again, we have a dedicated video on what skills are being looked on our YouTube channel. We have a dedicated live session on what skills are required for various data science roles, what is looked at for people with various levels of expertise and various backgrounds. But I'll talk more about the career transition paths here. So most likely you'll go from a fresher to a data analyst or a data scientist at a services company. That's one career path. Or better still, you can get into a product-based startup or even a good fast-growing startup as a data analyst, data scientist. More importantly, if you come from a CS background, you can also tackle the machine learning engineering roles. Again, if you're looking at machine learning engineer type of roles, those roles typically test for knowledge of both data structures, algorithms in some instances, because a machine learning engineer is like 50% software engineer, 50% data scientist, right? You need to have skills of both. So for a machine learning engineer type of role, one thing that you could do is, so CS folks can tackle all these roles, data analyst, data scientist. Again, my team is collating some of the questions. I'll come to them in a little while after I do the general framework. So back to where we are, fresher, CS background, smaller engineering college, right? So a good path for you to get started will be in a startup as a data analyst, data scientist, or a machine learning engineer. Your compensations can range. Typically what we observe for freshers is a compensation range anywhere from 6 lakhs to 22 lakhs, right? That's a typical range that we observe. Most of the students fall in that 10 to 12 bracket, most of the students that we observe. Right? Of course, it all depends on skills that you have, what interviews you can crack and things like that, right? So that's very important. And after working at a startup for a couple of years, after you build the core skills, again, the skills that you need to build in those 2 years typically tend to be, you have to become good at like data structures, algorithms, a little bit of machine learning design, actual in-depth machine learning, mathematical depth, applicative depth, solve a lot of machine learning problems, and then you can go into the top product-based companies. That's a typical path we see. Again, for freshers from CS background, people who go into services companies, rarely we see people jump from services companies to top product-based companies. We rarely see that. It happens in, I think, less than 1% of cases. And I mean, that's just I'm only talking statistics. I'm not taking one side or other side. I'm just telling you transition paths that we typically observe. So people who are coming from services, IT services companies, typically their career path into good product-based companies like FANG, Microsoft, all these good companies typically goes through a startup. Typically, in 99% of the cases. There are 1% exceptions here and there, but 99% of cases, that's what happens in most situations, right? So if you're a fresher CS, and if you want to get into machine learning, data science careers, you should target for a machine learning engineer role or a data scientist role as best as you can. Worst case, get into a data analyst role. Good startups, work there for a couple of years, build your knowledge base, and then jump to better companies, okay? Or you can grow within the same organization or company if the company is growing. That's a typical path that we observe. Now, next thing is, if you're a fresher, non-CS background, right? That's also important. It's a 4-year engineering course like mechanical, civil, electrical, chemical engineering, but you come from a non-CS background and you may have 0 to 2 years of experience. So for those candidates, typically, again, the career path, it is less likely that you get into a machine learning engineering role, because for machine learning engineer role, typically CS students are slightly more preferred because they learn more software engineering, more coding courses, operating systems, databases in more depth than a non-CS student. But you can easily crack data analyst roles and data scientist roles. Most of data scientist roles, because data scientist roles require you to know more mathematics. So that's a type of role that you can easily attempt for. In case you miss the data scientist role, you can also go for the data analyst role. Again, compensations might be slightly less than a CS student, because CS students typically tend to be better at data structures, algorithms, more coding practice, more coding knowledge, more operating systems, more databases and things like that. But we have seen people from non-CS backgrounds also do phenomenally well. Again, their career paths follow very similar trajectories to the CS folks. You can either get into services companies into data scientist roles, or you can get into startups in data scientist roles, spend a couple of years there. Again, we would recommend that you get into good, fast-growing startups, because the reason we recommend startups over large IT services companies is because not always, we don't recommend that always, but sometimes we recommend that in case the startup gives you a fast growth learning path, and it pays comparable or sometimes very often better than a lot of IT services companies, right? So in 2 years in a startup, you'll get to build a lot of things, learn a lot of things, and grow into the next role, either into large product-based companies or within the same organization into a senior data scientist role, right? So this is for people with a 4 years degree, like a BTech or even an MTech. At the end of the day, an MTech does not matter as long as you're doing it from the top 10 universities of India, or probably the equivalent across the world, all right? So again, if you're graduating from a BTech or an MTech from a large university, like a top university, top 10 universities of India, then you get campus placements, and that's a much easier path. But also note that, because I've been to a lot of these top university campus placements, the expectation from you tends to be higher than somebody coming from a smaller engineering college. Because you're coming from a top university, you're expected to know the inside out, not just of data structures and algorithms, but most importantly, the in-depth intricacies of machine learning and in-depth things, right? So that's important. Now, the second case, again, fresher, let's assume a 3-year bachelor's degree, let's say a BSc or a BCA, right? Or sometimes even non-science fields like BCom and other fields, we strongly recommend that you pursue a master's degree. Because in the industry, people typically prefer folks with either a 4-year bachelor's degree or a 3-year bachelor's degree plus a 2 years master's degree. That's the industry preference. Okay, this is, I'm not telling you what I prefer, I'm just saying what recruiters and interviewers, what we observe from our own experiences. So if you have a 3-year bachelor's degree, it is a good idea to pursue something like an MCA or an MS in computer science or an MSc in computer science, right? Or some equivalent field. If you can, there are some universities which are offering MSc in data science, right? Taking up some of these master's degree programs is strongly recommended. Again, it is all based on what companies are preferring. Now, if you're a 3-year degree student and if you don't want to pursue your master's degree, there are a couple of roles you can still get into. We typically see those people get into data analyst roles. Of course, the compensations are certainly lower than your typical data analyst with a 4-year degree. But even there, the opportunities are slightly lesser. Even for data analyst roles, a lot of companies prefer 3-year bachelor's degree, let's say BSc in physics plus 2 years, let's say MCA in computer science or MSc statistics and things like that, right? So people who have these 3 plus 2 years type of degrees, if it's not a CS degree, imagine if it's a statistics degree or if it's a physics degree, right? Or if it's a math degree, most likely you'll get into data analyst type of roles. Again, across a wide spectrum of companies, from services companies to large IT companies and things like that. And very likely from a data analyst role, in a couple of years, if you work hard, if you build the know-how, you can get into a data scientist role. That's a typical path that we again observe. But we strongly recommend you pursue a master's degree if you can. Okay, cool. Next comes, okay, our team is also sharing some interesting, okay, I'll come to these profiles of folks with, folks with some specific questions. I'll come to those. Now let's go into folks with more experience. That will be the crux here, right? Imagine if you're again, here also I'll break things into multiple segments. Imagine if you have IT experience, like software engineer, software tester, QA engineer, anywhere where you write some code. It could be any code, as long as you're writing code, any coding related experience if you have. Again, let me call that as IT experience. And non-IT experience, where you don't write any code. A code can also mean simple SQL queries and things like any IT experience, right? So working professionals will break it up into IT experience and non-IT experience. Within IT experience, again, there will be a lot of verticals for sure, right? And there will also be a lot of experiences. So let's talk about the first type of experience, right? 2 to 5 years, like typically like 3-year experienced candidates. They're no more freshers. They're no more treated as freshers, right? So somebody with say, let's say 3 or 4 years of IT experience, let's say IT services company, right? Let's take that case first. So in IT services, 2 to 3 years experience, typically a good career path that you can see is if you have written a lot of code in your roles, like if you have been a Java developer, you wrote a lot of code, you're comfortable with object-oriented programming, you're comfortable with some of the basic data structures in Java and things like that, a very logical role for you will be a machine learning engineer, or a computer vision engineer or an NLP engineer at good startups, at good product-based startups. That's very, very plausible. We see a lot of students do the transition, and the typical hike that we see is about 100% to 150%. There are exceptions. There are people who get like 300% hikes. There are people who get 40-50% hikes also. But typically we see around that 100% hike, which means literally doubling the salary that we typically observe for candidates in those 3 to 4 year type of work experience, right? Again, if you have coded in the past, a machine learning engineering type of role is very suitable for you. If you have been in a role where you have not coded much, then a data scientist at a good startup is a good path for you, because typically, again, the reason I'm recommending this is because from IT services, if you go to a good startup, you'll learn a lot, you'll build a lot of things, you'll learn a lot of cutting edge. And again, in startups, you get to do a lot of things in a quick span of time. And with that experience, you can jump into FANG-like companies. Again, most of the people that I have worked with in FANG or equivalent companies, and people whom I have seen come from IT services background, or people whom I have seen come from smaller engineering colleges, typically have at least one startup experience in their path. Sometimes multiple startup experiences, because they might join a small startup, build the skills, and then go to a unicorn startup, and then they keep jumping up the ladder of companies. And of course, jumping up the ladder of challenge, ladder of compensation also, right? This is a typical path that we observe. I'm not saying that somebody with 3-4 years in IT experiences cannot jump to a FANG-like company directly, but we see that happening very, very, less than typically 1% of candidates we see that happening. More often we see candidates going to a startup, building the skills and then jumping again. That's what we see for folks with 3 to 4 years experience. Now let's get into the bracket of like 7-8 years, right? So this is like 5 to 10 year bracket. So at this point of time, typically like 7-8 years, right? At this point of time, people have become leads or people have become senior engineers in a lot of companies. So at this point of time, the career transition again is slightly different, because by this time, if you have like 6-7 years of experience in software development, you are expected to be very good with system design, right? Or if you have been a DevOps engineer, right, you're expected to be really, really good with DevOps, right? So realistically speaking, so in such cases, you can transition into ML engineering roles a lot if you're solid with system design and things like that. You can also get into core data science roles, like a data scientist or a senior data scientist type of roles. But the maturity that's expected from you, whether the code you write, whether the solutions that you build, whether it's about deployment of machine learning models or your depth of understanding, right? For example, if imagine there is a 6 to 7 year experienced candidate, and let's say software engineer, somebody who has actually built software, and he comes to an interview for a startup, the startup will expect that candidate to be able to say, how will you design a solution to a real world problem reasonably well, with all the business constraints of latency, throughput, all of those things, right? So that's what we typically suggest. And the career transitions for them will be, if you're a senior engineer, you can comfortably go into a senior data scientist or a senior machine learning engineer type of roles. Again, if you're at IT services, you can always go into good product-based startups and then large product-based companies. That's a typical path that we typically observe. Of course, in addition to the additional requirements, you're expected to be strong in machine learning depth, wherein you're expected to know the internals of how everything is working. I mean, lot of companies ask you to explain. Suppose if you have used, let's say, BERT, okay, which is a transformer-based model. A lot of companies will ask you, hey, explain me the mathematics underlying BERT, because you're a senior engineer. You're expected to know some of these internal stuff, right? Similarly, if you've solved a problem, they could ask you questions like, okay, how do we do it with lower latency? This is what good product-based startups do, and then you can jump again from a product-based startup to a large product-based company. Now comes the people with like 10 to 15 years of experience. For these people, the typical transitions we see are as follows. Whatever role they are in, because they're already in a managerial role, sometimes an architect type of role, typical career transitions we see is when they start learning machine learning or AI, they typically start applying those concepts to the project or to the solution or to the problem that they're currently solving. That is very, very important. That initiative, because you're already at a fairly senior level, you're expected to take whatever you're learning, incorporate that into your current role, right? And that opens up doors, because that will start counting as experience, because you're in a position where if you have a client at an IT services company, you can talk to the client and say, hey, we have done all this stuff, but here is a small machine learning module that we wanted to build, right? Which will add value to you, right? So again, for these people, very, very logical career transition is if you're a manager or if you're an architect who has like 10 to 15 years of experience in whatever field you are, try to apply whatever machine learning you're learning to the current project or to the current solutions that you're building. And that will help you get into, within the same organization, you can get into a data science manager or an analytics manager, or sometimes just a machine learning manager type of roles, or you can get into a senior data scientist, sometimes even a principal data scientist type of roles. That's what we typically observe. We see a lot of people, architects, going into that principal data scientist type of roles. Again, a logical path, if you're coming from IT services, will be good product-based companies, and then to good product-based startups, and then to larger companies. That's again the typical path that we often observe. Most importantly, if you're a manager already, right? So my suggestion, if you're slightly in a manager or a senior manager type of role, try to incorporate machine learning into your current team's projects or solutions that you're building, because going from a software development manager to a data science manager is very plausible. It's a slower transition, but it's very doable to do in a couple of years. I've seen a lot of people do that from like 10 to 15 years of work experience, architect level expertise to a senior data scientist or a data science manager or a principal data scientist and things like that, right? So very importantly, you have to apply what you're learning to the current role that you're part of. Now, again, within IT services, within services companies, if you have an IT experience where you're not writing a lot of code, maybe you're doing a QA or you're doing testing or one of these types of roles, most likely career transitions for you will be into, again, data analyst or data scientist type of roles, less likely to be machine learning engineer type of roles, because machine learning engineers typically are expected to be good software engineers who can write software and things like that. But the data scientist role is fully open to everyone, or you could also be a senior data analyst and types of roles like that. Make sure, again, the same logic applies. If you have if you're somebody with 10 plus of years of experience, suppose you're doing some testing, right? Can you automate some of the testing? For example, I think we published a very interesting success story, I think just today morning, if I'm not wrong, of somebody who worked in quality control for 5 years. Right? Here is somebody who has worked in quality control and built their own simple Python tool, right, to automate some of the aspects of quality control so that the team can review more things faster. Right? So imagine to simple automation, if you can add some machine learning, deep learning techniques to it, if you can automate some of these things, right, that shows that even in testing, even in other areas, you can automate a bunch of things, not just using simple Python coding, but also using machine learning models and things like that. That will be very good. That will show, especially if you are like that 5 plus years or better still 10 plus years experience, that initiative to apply whatever you are learning to the problems at hand and adding value. I believe this candidate that we posted the success story today morning clearly said that one of his interviews was very much on very much on the tool that he built to automate some of the quality control checks that his team was doing. Right? So very interesting stuff. So even if you're not working in coding related IT services jobs, even if it is like testing, QA, try to apply as much of what you're learning in machine learning and data science, especially for folks with 5 plus years or 10 plus years of experience. Cool. Now comes what if you have work experience but in non-IT? Let's assume you work in let's say mechanical engineering or electrical engineering or some field like that, right? How does everything work then? So our suggestion is this: typically people who come from non-IT backgrounds, we've seen people from marketing background, from sales background, etc. Again, if you come from an engineering hands-on field, typically a career path seems to be that you can get into data science roles. Like we've seen a few people from finance background, right? We've seen a few people from marketing analytics type of background, right? Basically, they're just crunching a lot of marketing data. Some from sales. So there are two broad roles that you will get into. Very likely you'll get into the data analyst type of role, or if you're good and strong in math and if you're comfortable with programming and if you've picked up programming, you can also get into the data scientist type of roles. There's a very, very low chance that you'll get into the machine learning engineering role, because that's typically for people who are very good at coding, come from CS backgrounds, etc. We see most people going into that senior data analyst or analytics manager type of roles in similar industries, or sometimes even completely outside that industry, or the data scientist role. Again, depending on your experiences, more experience, suppose imagine if you're somebody with 10 years of mechanical engineering experience, right? So then when you're being interviewed for a data scientist role, people will ask you, hey, how did you take this machine learning and data science that you've learned? How do you apply it to all the work that you have done till now? Again, there are some machine learning roles in companies which typically hire mechanical engineers, right? But these mechanical engineers also can look outside, right? So if you're coming from non-IT experience, most likely your career transition path will be like very high likelihood, like 70% chance to a data analyst role, 30% chance to a data scientist role, and then again, startups to larger product-based companies, sometimes even IT services companies. We see a lot of people with non-IT experience getting into data analyst and data scientist roles in IT services companies also, right? Because imagine if your client is somebody who is working on oil mining, right? Then somebody who has the domain knowledge of oil mining, who also knows data science, is a very good fit for that team, right? Cool. So this is your typical non-IT experience. And again, one question that many of you might be, okay, so there are a bunch of questions that our team has shared. Again, I'll just quickly look at these and try to answer as many as possible. Okay, so this is from Piyush Malviya. I have 4 years of database developer experience and aspiring to transition into machine learning domain. How much hike can I expect and how difficult will it be to switch without prior ML knowledge? So if you have like that 4 years of database developer experience, I mean, we typically see people getting that 100%, typically, I mean, I'm talking about median numbers, typically like 100% hike on top of their current compensation is very likely. There are exceptions where they get 300%, 400%. There are also exceptions where they get only 40, 50%. But more realistically, a 100% hike is something that you can comfortably expect if you know the stuff inside out. Okay, so again, it will not be trivial for you because as a database developer, there are some advantages. For example, you already know SQL very well. I'm assuming if you've worked for 4 years as a database developer, you also know how to write optimized database queries. So go build up your skills from there. Become good at doing data analysis, writing very optimal SQL queries, also processing large amounts of data using something like Spark or NoSQL databases. That will be that, because that way you're building on top of your expertise that you have. And you'll have to learn all the machine learning, deep learning, the mathematics, the programming, everything you have to learn. That part you cannot skip, right? But in your interviews, there will be surely more focus on the data pre-processing, writing optimized SQL queries and things like that because you have 4 years of work experience in that field. It's very fairly doable. Again, let me make this very clear. Transitioning into machine learning is not trivial. Let me make that very, very clear. We typically see students who put in roughly about 12 to 15 hours of effort a week, take about 8 to 9 months of good effort, consistent effort. Okay, most students of ours who succeed typically put in, like an average student needs to put in the 12 to 15 hours of effort over a 8 to 9 month period. That's a realistic work estimate. If you're not willing to do it, don't think that learning machine learning is like learning Python. It's not. Python is just a minuscule, it's like 10% of learning machine learning. So please don't underestimate the effort, but it's very doable. It's very, very doable, and the career opportunities are certainly very good, and you get to do cutting edge work also, right? So it's doable as long as you commit yourself to putting in these 12 to 15 hours of effort over a 8 to 9 months period. Okay, cool. This is Manoj who says, I have more than 16 years of experience in IT, software development and project management. I would like to know what are the opportunities for me in data science or machine learning. Nice question. So Manoj, you fall into that bracket of people who are mostly at an architect level or a manager or even a senior manager type of role or even a product manager or a product owner type of role. So for you, the logical path is whatever product you're managing or architecting, try and incorporate machine learning and deep learning and data science modules as part of it. The typical career transition paths we observe for people like you is whatever project they are managing, whichever client it is, or even if it is for their own internal purpose, they try and incorporate or automate some of the things that can be automated using machine learning or even simple Python automation, right? Do that, and that will give you real hands-on experience, which you can build either to grow within your own organization into a data science or a machine learning architect or externally. Right? It is very doable. We've seen people with 15 years experience or more typically get into that principal architect or the chief data scientist at smaller startups, right? So that transition, we've seen people do it a lot, but of course, you're expected to have much more maturity in terms of product development, in terms of software development. For example, a typical thing that is expected out of you is if you've done, let's say, 15 years of software development, right? That 15 years of software development has to show in the projects and portfolio of work that you do, right? Your portfolio of work should not be like what a fresher has done or somebody with 2 to 3 years of experience has done. Like for example, you could actually take a real world problem and say, hey, here is, let me give you a simple example. Again, we have a full detailed live session on what types of problems people from various backgrounds can solve. But to give you a simple example, right? Suppose imagine if you're trying to do some, okay, let's build something very, I'm just giving an example of something that's expected out of 15 plus years candidates, right? So some of you might know about Grammarly, right? Grammarly is this online plugin that you can put in, which corrects whatever you're typing, it corrects it, right? So this was a question actually asked to one of our students who has that 15 plus years of experience in one of the interviews. So the interviewer said, okay, here is a system. How do we solve this problem? Suppose I have let's say Google Docs. I'm typing something in some document. I want a machine learning system to tell me all the grammar corrections possible. And it has to happen at scale. It has to happen low latency. Now, how do you build this whole solution? All right. Of course, there's always machine learning, deep learning, state-of-the-art deep learning models, but there's also a lot of engineering behind it. How do you ensure that it's low latency? How much compute will you do on the local box? How much compute will you do in the server end? Right? There is also a lot of product management aspects in it. Like, what do you prioritize? Right? What aspects will you launch in V1? So these are typical stuff like end-to-end real-world problem solving of real-world systems that you encounter is what is expected from people with 10 plus or 15 plus years of experience. That's the skill level that you should be at. Cool. So this is from Jaya Subbareddy, and she says, currently I'm working in credit risk management and as a portfolio manager. Will ML use cases be good for me? Okay, so Jaya, I'm assuming you have a lot of domain expertise in portfolio management and also in credit risk management. Again, a lot of these areas, like a lot of modern fintech companies and neo banks that are starting right now, right? A lot of these companies are building their own credit card businesses. Again, you might have seen this in some IPL, like modern credit card systems there is a lot of fintech revolution that's happening. Like, I've spoken to some of these companies because I know some of their heads of data science and machine learning whom I've worked with in the past. And there is a lot of innovation that's possible there. Everything from just saying, hey, how much loan should we give? What should be the credit card limit for this person? Right? There is a whole revolution called neo banks that's happening in fintech. Right? There are a lot of these investment companies, the small fintech investment companies. So there is a lot of potential there if you're willing to explore such options. Though all these neo banks, all the modern banks, including traditional banks like HDFC, have started building large machine learning organizations of their own because they want to get some of this work in-house. The traditional, like for example, if you look at some of the American banks, right, they have their development centers in India. Like Wells Fargo has a very large development center. They have also started building a very large data science team here. For some of it could be anywhere from credit risk management, portfolio management, a wide spectrum of finance-related problems. So if you have deep domain expertise in such an area, learning machine learning will open up these doors in the intersection of the domain expertise and the machine learning, right? Because I believe that these things will fall more and more into the purview of data science teams, not just in neo banks and more modern fintech companies, but also the larger ones. Cool. Very nice question. Sonu says, nowadays, what I'm seeing is every fifth person is thinking about switching into data science roles. The thing scares me is if I think about future in the upcoming 5 years, will the demand exist? Very nice question. So let me answer this with some historical context. In the early 2000s, right, because I've seen that wave, right, everybody wanted to be a software engineer, right? Has the demand for software engineers died out? The world needs many more software engineers, and software engineers who are good are the best paid in the industry right now. Right? I know a lot of good software engineers with like 10 years of experience who are paid close to 1.5 crores to 2 crores in top FANG companies in India and top FANG or top product based companies. I'm not talking machine learning guys. I'm talking software engineers. Good solid software engineers earn really top dollar or top rupee even in India. I'm not talking Silicon Valley. I'm talking about Bangalore and Hyderabad and areas like these, right? So what has happened is the demand hasn't reduced. Right? And those who are really good have gone to the top. Those who are not good, they're just like general software engineers. Everybody calls themselves as software engineers, but there's a huge spectrum in that skill. There is a really huge spectrum in that skill, right? So we don't see the demand for software engineers reducing, at least not in the next 5 years, because what's happening right now is more and more companies, including small startups to large giant organizations and multiple teams within an organization want to build some data science or machine learning level expertise because they can optimize their business or they can optimize their offering or their services much better through this. I believe over the next 5 years, the demand will only increase, but as with demand increasing, everybody is saying, hey, I'm a data scientist, just like the way I know people who can't explain how a dictionary or a hash table works who call themselves software engineers. That is the biggest joke, right? I've seen people who can't explain how logistic regression works internally, they call themselves data scientists. So the industry knows how to segregate these people. The really good solid ones will grow to the top. The not so good ones, the people who don't know how things work internally, the people who just know how to call a scikit-learn function will fall behind. That's the reality of it, right? Cool. So, okay, so this is from Nitin Venugopal. Again, my team is collating the questions so as to just create a sample. So I have 2 years of experience in TCS and 3 years in SBI in pure banking. And I have I'm about 27 years old, and how can I make a transition? Very nice question. So Nitin, we've seen a lot of people go from like companies or organizations like SBI, other large government-owned banks. Of course, if you have the domain expertise of banking and financial services, to more modern fintech companies, right? So if you're planning to pick a career in data science, your best bet will be fintech startups or even large companies like HDFC who are setting up their own fintech organizations or their own data science organizations within the broader umbrella, or it could even be foreign banks or foreign financial institutions like Wells Fargo, which is setting up data science organizations. So in your case, you have to build on top of your domain expertise. Again, this is especially true for people who come from non-computer science backgrounds. Even for people with computer science backgrounds, always build, if you have like 3 to 5 years experience, right? Build on top of your core skill. If you're coming from banking domain, come on, you know banking much more than I would, right? Because I've never worked in banking. So see how you can build your machine learning skills and transition into a role in the intersection of banking or financial services and machine learning. And such roles are increasing, right? No doubt about that. Having said that, similarly, if you're coming from a CS background, right? Suppose if you're coming from some automation testing. Automation testing, typically people write scripts. Can you automate some of those parts also using deep learning or NLP or some modern technology so that even the automation, instead of doing manual automation, you can do some AI-driven automation behind the scenes. Okay, so whatever field you're working on, try to build on top of it. That's very, very important. Cool. Oh, so this is a nice question from a completely different industry. Ganesh says, I have 13 years of experience in logistics. Okay, so Ganesh, and what are my opportunities to get into logistics related companies for data science and machine learning roles? Very, very likely. I don't know what is your exact role in the logistics company, but if you know the internals of logistics, how logistics companies work internally, not just logistics organizations, but a lot of e-commerce companies, a lot of food delivery companies, right? So those people, because having strong domain expertise in logistics, whether it's the last mile delivery or whether it's countrywide logistics or countrywide supply chains, if you have deep domain expertise in logistics, lot of logistics, because I have some of my friends who used to work on the logistics side of large e-commerce companies in India, and a lot of that could be like, instead of using classical logistics or supply chain optimization stuff, people have put in deep learning or state-of-the-art machine learning systems, and they could improve these systems quite drastically. So if you're coming from 13 years of deep, again, I'm assuming you have deep domain expertise of how logistics work, the internals of logistics, then I think the whole field is ahead of you in terms of, again, you can also start as a data analyst or a senior data analyst type of role in an e-commerce company or a food delivery company, and then you can work your way into a data scientist role. That's a very likely path if you don't have any technical expertise or coding related experience, if you just have deep domain logistics expertise. Okay, cool. Okay, so this is from Katyal. I'm into automation, having 7 years of experience. I'm working in Samsung, want to move into a top product based company, right? So what's your opinion about it? Okay, so Katyal, I'm assuming that when you say automation, I believe code automation, not the mechanical engineering or other aspects of what Samsung also does. So if you're like if you're writing some code optimization, if you're doing some automation testing type of stuff for 7 years, I'm assuming, especially at a company like Samsung, which is pretty good. Of course, not certainly at the same level as Google or Facebook and equivalent companies, but certainly pretty good. I'm sure you are very, very comfortable with programming. That's number one. So I'm also sure that you would be fairly comfortable with data structures algorithms. So pick up all the machine learning internals, pick up all of that. And with 7 years of experience there, you can comfortably get into machine learning engineering roles at Samsung itself. Why not do that? Because you're already working at Samsung. Build your strong portfolio of skills, build some good projects which are relevant to what Samsung is working on in whichever location you're working. Imagine if you're working in Samsung Bangalore. Samsung Bangalore does a bunch of computer vision work, right? So we would strongly recommend that you can look at even internal transitions from an automation engineer to something like a machine learning engineer. That's very, very plausible, very, very doable. And from there, from Samsung, if you have a couple of years at a company like Samsung, you can easily jump into the top FANG-like companies, right? So that's a very logical path. That's a typical path that we would expect you to take. Cool. Okay, so the scope of data science beyond 10 years and scope in healthcare. Again, Thirumalai, this is a question from Thirumalai Rajan. So to be honest with you, predicting anything 10 years into the future is too risky because it's hard to predict what things will change in 10 years, right? For example, 10 years back, I did not assume that convolution neural networks, LSTMs and transformers would transform machine learning and deep learning this much. Remember 2011, right? We are in 2021. I never assumed that because the first major breakthroughs in convolution neural networks were around 2012. I never assumed, even in my like grandest dreams, that so much will be done over the next decade, but so much was done. So I think it's foolish to assume something 10 years into the future, but just like any other role like software engineering or anything, machine learning will get specialized. The best of machine learning and data science guys will have a great career. The not so good ones will have a mediocre or below average career, right? So again, 10 years I can't predict, but 5 years we can get a sense of what's going to happen in a 5-year time, right? So as far as healthcare is concerned, we were talking to a very large healthcare organization in India. I believe it's one of the top 3 largest healthcare organizations. And we were having a discussion with them recently. And they are so bullish. And remember, they are the top 3 healthcare organizations in India. We're talking to some of their team members who work on research, cutting edge stuff and things like that. And they said they're so bullish about what can be done in a country like India over the next 10 years using state-of-the-art advances in deep learning. They're very, very bullish. And a lot of the large universities, organizations, startups in the US, including big ones like Apple, right? They're investing tons of money into some, at least partial diagnoses or help in diagnosis in healthcare. I would bet that healthcare will be one of the most impacted areas because of modern machine learning and deep learning over the next decade. That's my personal bet. I may be wrong, but that's what I would also personally wish to be true because it impacts so many lives. But I see the potential there. Again, from our own interactions with some really big industry experts and research teams, this is what we see. Cool. Okay, so this is from Devansh. I think this question is also repeated multiple times. I come from a non-BTech background and I want to crack data science or machine learning engineer roles in a FANG or FANG-M type of companies. I think M there is Microsoft. How should we learn data structures and algorithms? The bar is lower than SDE, but how much and what topics should we cover and leave? Okay, very nice question. Devansh, typically if you are interviewing for a machine learning engineer role at a FANG-like company, you would have typically 1, maybe 2 rounds of data structures and algorithms. And the bar is slightly lower than a software development engineer, not too low. Right? This bar is slightly lower than a software development engineer, but you're expected to know the whole spectrum of techniques from data structures, time complexity, space complexity, graph algorithms, dynamic programming, recursion, greedy algorithms, the whole gamut of things. Of course, if you don't know some advanced data structure like a trie or something, that's okay, not a problem. But the regular data structures and algorithms you're expected to know, and typically the questions you might be asked are slightly easier than what are typically asked for a software development engineer. Right? And even if you give not a perfect solution, perfect time and space complexity, but a reasonably good one, they would most likely accept it. So in terms of topics, especially for machine learning engineer roles, for a data scientist role, the focus is much less on data structures and algorithms, general CS data structures algorithms. It is more in the context of machine learning, numerical programming, and things like that, right? So for example, for a data scientist type of thing, questions could be around, okay, implement multiplication of two sparse matrices efficiently, right? This is a very nice question. This is very numerical programming. It is very, very relevant in the context of data science machine learning because we operate with so many sparse matrices, right? So you have to think about how do you store this data, how do you multiply these efficiently, and things like that. So for a data scientist type of roles, you would still have programming, you would still have to know basic data structures algorithms, but very, very often they will be in the context of numerical programming, or you have to use pandas, or you have to use SQL to build a solution. For machine learning engineer type of roles, data structures and algorithms are more or less necessary from just like the typical CS background folks. That's why very often large FANG-like companies typically don't entertain as many non-CS folks for their machine learning engineering type of roles. And the reasoning behind is traditionally in a lot of their interviews, these people could not crack your standard data structures and algorithms types of interviews, typically from their own experiences. So they would typically consider you for data analyst or a data scientist type of role. Cool. So this is from Likith. Okay, I'm a statistical programmer working in pharma industry with 4 years of experience. My skills are mostly in SAS and clinical data. Very interesting. I do standardization, all the stuff, data analysis, efficacy of drugs, etc. Very nice. So Likith, given that you have some exposure to statistics, data analysis, of course in the pharma domain, using SAS or SAS, which is again not as widely used in other domains, I would say just pick up Python. Should be fairly easy for you if you have written enough SAS programs. I believe right now you might be doing a lot of statistical analysis, also graduate into hardcore machine learning, deep learning. Of course, since you have a few years of 4 years of experience in pharma industry, build on top of it, do good case studies or projects in and around pharma, right? It could even be like protein folding problems that AlphaGo is working on right now, right? That's like the bleeding edge of pharma and state-of-the-art deep learning or deep reinforcement learning. Do some good projects and good case studies around that, and you can look both within the pharma domain and also outside the pharma domain. So within India, the pharma domain is still not at a level where they're applying state-of-the-art deep learning, protein folding type of stuff. Again, that's still in the very, very bleeding edge of even the pharma industry. So build the skills, and given that you already have some expertise like a statistical programmer, doing some data analysis, it's fairly easy for you to transition into hardcore data scientist roles, even outside the pharma industry. Cool. Cool. Just give me a second. Okay, this is Anish. I'm working IT professional in the IT industry, 9 years of experience, automation tester. Cool. Okay. Okay. So here, okay. So Anish has about 9 years of working experience as an automation tester, and he wants to build a career in healthcare AI. So if you're very sure of what sort of problem you want to work on, today healthcare AI in a country like India is still driven largely by smaller startups. There are a few large companies like Apollo, etc., which are still setting up some of their data science and machine learning stuff, but it's still driven heavily by startups both in the US and in India, right? So your best bet, some of the students that we have seen who have joined healthcare or healthcare related companies, typically they've worked on really good healthcare problems, whether it's NLP or because you really liked the breast cancer detection, right? So there is something called as, so there are a bunch of CNN convolution neural network based algorithms to detect these fairly reliably well, right? I was talking to my professor at Indian Institute of Science, and they've started working for a while on how to detect COVID reasonably well using just chest X-rays, because X-rays are much cheaper, right? It's a research project that they're doing now. So there is a lot of that potential, but most likely you will get into a startup which is either based in India or based out of US, which is doing in healthcare AI. Again, it could be a wide spectrum of things. As an automation tester, I'm assuming you have decent programming skills because you have that 9 to 10 years of experience. Make sure that if you're interested in a specific domain, do 2 or 3 good end-to-end case studies. When I say end-to-end case studies, everything from obtaining data, cleaning data, the whole modeling pipeline, analysis, data analysis, productionization of models, deployment of models, scaling of models, do that whole spectrum. Do 2 or 3 projects, learn the depth of, because healthcare AI today, especially in the image world, is driven a lot by CNN based architectures or convolution neural network based architectures. You can certainly build your career there. 10 years experience should not be a detriment to your aspirations of trying to work on healthcare AI. It's very doable. Of course, you will have to put in that effort and build really solid case studies, really solid piece of work in healthcare AI so that you can show it to a startup and say, hey, I have all this experience, but I'm passionate about this. Here is my work. And there's a decent chance that you will get interviewed by some of these companies. And if you crack it, very good. Cool. Okay, so another very important case that I forgot to handle, which came up as a question. So imagine if you are somebody with a career gap. Again, career gaps come in all shapes and sizes, right? Typically, what we see folks with career gap, again, there are different types of career gap. Let's be very frank there. Imagine if you have graduated with your bachelor's degree, you don't have any career, you did not work anywhere for whatever reason, and you have, let's say, 2 to 3 year career break, or probably even more. Most of the cases we see is these people go into, because some of these people prepared for some competitive exams, UPSC, all of that. Unfortunately, they could not crack it. So the most logical path that we see, or the most often pursued path that we see for them, is they get into internships, and either at the same company or very soon after they finish the internship, most of them get into paid internships. It's very doable. A decent pay internship at a product-based startup, and then they jump into full-time roles. This is the typical path that we observe. Again, that's one type of career break. The other type of career break is, imagine if you have, let's say, 5-6 years of experience, and this happens very often with women, right? Because of their family responsibilities, because they want to build a family, they might take a couple of years, 2 to 3 years of career break. For those career break, it's not as severe because you have prior work experience already, right? So if you have such career break, we would first recommend that you get, suppose if you're working as, let's say database administrator earlier, I would say as soon as you want to get back into work, refresh those concepts because you have a lot of that experience. Get into a database administrator role again, and then start pursuing machine learning instead of increasing this gap further. There are exceptions to this rule. We also have women who have like 5-6 years of experience and they took maternity leave or maternity breaks, and then during the maternity break they've learned machine learning and deep learning and cracked like tons of roles. We've seen many of those women also. So that's also another path that you can pursue, but make sure that your career break is not too large, and getting into the same role that you've worked on earlier is typically easier. Cool. Okay, so this is, I don't want to name him because he has put in his salary. For a person having 10 years of experience and 30 lakhs per annum compensation in a QA or a software development and testing type of role, what should such an individual expect with a data science or a machine learning job? What are the typical salary one can get? I think if you have 10 years of experience, if you're a good, like a software engineer or a QA engineer, and if you continue to have really good skills in machine learning, from 30 lakhs, you can easily go into that whole bracket of 45 to 70 lakhs, right? We have seen people like this with 10 years of experience, not machine learning, but somewhere else, who have gotten like into that, again, it's very similar to yours, 25 to 30 lakhs per annum compensation ranges, very good in machine learning, they've built the right skills, they can comfortably get into that 45 to 70 lakhs compensation ranges. That's very doable. It's typically either FANG-like or large product-based companies or unicorn type of startups. Those are the typical two sets of companies that we see which typically offer that 45 to 70. This is a window that I'm giving you, a more realistic window. There might be exceptions to the rule, but this is a typical window that we see in terms of compensations for people like you with a 30 lakhs compensation, 10 years of experience. Very nice question from Mohan Krishna. Are companies expecting us to write code of all ML algorithms from scratch without using pre-existing algorithmic libraries? Or is it enough to know the concept and mathematics behind the algorithms? Very nice question. While in your actual job, you might not have to implement many of these algorithms from scratch. I won't say not always, 90% of the times you don't have to implement it. In interviews, good product-based startups and product-based companies will expect you to know how the things work internally, and you should have the ability to implement these things from scratch. What is the reason behind it? Tomorrow there is a new research paper, let's say, and you have to implement that research paper for one of your products or solutions. If you can't implement, let's say, a BERT or a transformer-based algorithm, how will you implement a new research paper? Or imagine there is already some open source implementation by the paper authors, but it's not written optimally for your needs. If you can't write or implement an algorithm from scratch, right, using TensorFlow, PyTorch, whatever library of your choice is, or Keras, right? If you can't implement it from scratch, how will you modify it to your needs? Again, what good product-based companies and good product-based startups are looking for from good engineers is this. Given any machine learning or deep learning algorithm, can you implement things from scratch? That is very, very important. And if you're an experienced software engineer or if you're an experienced engineer, can you do it super efficiently with low latency, high throughput and things like that? That is super duper important, right? Because that's what will be your actual work in a real setup, right? So that's why even in our courses and various academic programs we ask students to implement many of these algorithms from scratch. That's why we have actually done code walkthrough sessions where we implement a transformer model from scratch, line by line in TensorFlow or Keras. That ability is super duper important. We make students in our applied AI course, we make students implement logistic regression from scratch, implement SGD from scratch, implement a simple backpropagation on a simple deep neural network from scratch, implement self-attention from scratch. Because most people just hand wave their way through it. Again, this is a feedback that one of my friends gave me, and he's a very senior engineer. He was my classmate during my graduate school days, very senior engineer at one of the FANG-like companies, and he's like a staff engineer now. And he said, hey, I go to all the top universities of India, the top 5-10 universities of India, and one of my favorite questions is I ask people, just implement self-attention. He just says, write a function which implements self-attention. He says 90% of students can't do it, and these are from the top universities of India. Okay, that's the unfortunate reality. Or they can't answer if we just modify slightly something in self-attention. They can't decipher what's happening in it, right? And his argument is these people don't actually understand self-attention in its full granular detail. That's why sometimes many of them they can't even implement self-attention from scratch. Or in other words, if I modify the self-attention slightly and say, hey, why doesn't this work, or why does this work better? They can't answer, right? And that's the unfortunate reality of it. So you have to learn to implement these things from scratch, to answer that question in short. Okay, so this is Teja who says, can you help us understand the difference between data engineers and data scientists? Even though this is slightly out of context, I still want to spend a couple of minutes on this question, because a data engineer, typically, their responsibility is to build the data pipeline. Your data could be some data could be sitting in a relational database, some in data warehouse, some in just JSON files, right? Some in, let's say, HDFS on Spark. Your data could be sitting in some NoSQL database, right? A data engineer's job is to fetch all this data, pre-process all the data, and do the whole data engineering, data formatting, getting it into a shape where downflow systems or engineers or scientists can use. So their job is mostly a data engineering, which is data modification, joins, data pipelines, all of that stuff. They don't do as much of data analysis and things like that. A data scientist, on the other hand, their job is they should be able to do some of the data engineering work, but they may not be experts in data engineering work. They mostly know SQL, little bit of scripting of Python and things like that. They can get their data, but they analyze the data, build machine learning models, deploy these machine learning models and things like that. That's a fundamental difference. Data engineering is basically software engineering, or they're typically software engineers who build great data pipelines. Their work is mostly data pipelining. Okay. Cool. Very nice. So Ashish Panda says, I'm working as a big data cloud engineer and have 12 years of experience. Can I switch to ML engineer or data scientist from a data engineer? Are we covering how to work on ML in the cloud? Yes. So that's a very natural path. We see a lot of folks in the data engineering and in the cloud computing world transition to machine learning engineering because a lot of machine learning now is getting deployed in the cloud because nobody wants to spend money buying on-premise resources, right? That's why even in our course videos, we cover multiple aspects of cloud-related machine learning, whether it is how do you deploy models on AWS, whether it's how do you use something like Heroku, which is platform as a service, how do you do containerization, how do you use something like Kubeflow, which is an ML ops platform open sourced by Google, or how do you use SageMaker. We cover all of this in the context of actually deploying these models on the cloud because that's a natural path. And for somebody like you who is already a data engineer, who's already a cloud engineer, I think you have all the engineering skills. What you need to build is the machine learning and data science mathematical skills. The moment you build those skills, it's a very natural transition from a data engineering or a cloud engineering role to a machine learning engineering role. So for some of your case studies, right, a very interesting project that you can think of is take a state-of-the-art deep learning model. And since you already know cloud engineering, right, I'm assuming you know some DevOps, you know some scaling, distributed systems and things like that. One challenge that you can think of is, hey, can I actually deploy a machine learning, a state-of-the-art, a very complex deep learning type of model wherein I can do the inference, which means I give a query and I should get an answer within, let's say, 10 or 20 milliseconds. How do you build an extremely low latency, something like a 10,000 query throughput machine? Because you're already coming from cloud engineering background, right? So a natural way is, in addition to your cloud engineering, you also learn machine learning and combine both of them because it's a very important challenge. And the more logical path for you is not actually a data scientist, but a machine learning engineering path. That's what is most relevant in your context. Cool. Okay, so there is another set of students, very nice actually. So there are also some students who are pursuing their advanced degrees, especially PhD, in areas like quantum computing or in other areas of computer science, sometimes even in areas like metallurgy and these areas, electrical engineering, etc. So we also see, we have seen some PhD students from aerospace engineering, from manufacturing type of engineering or metallurgy and things like that. For them, their transition path typically looks like this, which is as part of their PhD thesis, whatever work they're working on, can you learn machine learning, take all the knowledge of machine learning and use it as part of your PhD thesis to solve an interesting problem. Right? That's superb, right? You have a great PhD thesis because, like, if you take an area like, let's say, metallurgy, right? I mean, there will be so many interesting problems in metallurgy that I would never know of. But you know of these problems, you know of this domain as a PhD student. So can you apply some state-of-the-art in machine learning and deep learning and solve these problems? For example, recently I was reading some very interesting research work where state-of-the-art deep learning models have been used for computational fluid dynamics. Like, I'm no expert in CFD, but I know the basics of it. But it's a very interesting thing in the intersection of mechanical engineering or computational fluid dynamics and deep learning. Very interesting. There are people who are applying this to atmospheric sciences. I have a friend of mine who is right now a professor at IIT Kharagpur, and he has worked extensively in atmospheric sciences, various research centers of atmospheric sciences across India, and he's trying to apply state-of-the-art deep learning models to atmospheric sciences, right? Similarly, if you're studying like one of the students, Chetan says, I'm a PhD student in quantum computing. A very phenomenal area in quantum computing that I'm learning right now is quantum deep learning. Right? Again, I'm not an expert in it. I'm reading a bunch of research papers. I know the basics of quantum computing, but in your PhD thesis, you can look at how quantum deep learning algorithms can be designed, or how quantum computing or optimization techniques in quantum computing can train deep learning models much faster. Or take simple quantum computing systems that are available, like the programming tools that are currently available to us, right? Some basic system that's available, and try and see how you can take a state-of-the-art deep learning model and train it 100x faster, right? So those are the types of ideas that I would recommend. So as a PhD student, you have lot of potential, tons and tons of potential on applying these concepts. Okay, cool. So I'm also looking at the chat window. Okay, so Rohit says I'm an MCA student and I just graduated and I'm working in a services based company for the last 2 months. If I want to be a data scientist, what should I do? Simple. Learn, become good at Python programming because you already are an MCA student. I'm assuming you know basic data structures and algorithms. Become a good programmer. That's super duper important. Learn machine learning, data science, everything in depth. Start from the mathematical foundations, learn these things, do as many case studies as possible, learn as much from publicly available blogs as you can, do 2 or 3 good case studies. Since you are mostly a fresher, it's a very easy transition for you. Again, from freshers, the expectation is also lower, right? I mean, typically, right? As always. So cool. Okay. Just give me a second. I'm looking at the chat window. Okay, so Madhu says, I'm from metallurgy background. Can I do MTech in CSC and crack ML and AI roles? Why not? In a typical MTech program, if you're planning to do an MTech program in CS, make sure you take data structures, algorithms, you take some databases courses and take a lot of machine learning and data science courses. You can surely crack a lot of good machine learning and AI roles, right? Because you have a master's degree in CS. Okay, one second. So this is from Santosh. I'm a fresh graduate from IIT K. I'm assuming Kanpur here. Prior to my master's, I worked as a CFD engineer for 3 years. Is it possible to get an internship or job in data science if I spend a good amount of time in preparation? Certainly. Like, I don't know what area you've graduated from, but if you have the right skills, again, computational fluid dynamics certainly has some amount of computation, mathematical programming or numerical programming and things like that. So if you can pick up machine learning and data science, you're mostly a fresher, it should be fairly easy to get into data science careers. Not a problem at all. So this is Jotsi who says, I have a choice between masters between computational science stream, which has high performance computing, and data science. Which one should I choose? So Jotsi, if you want to get into data science field, choose data science. That's a no-brainer, right? But if you want to get into, let's say, supercomputing or distributed computing and things like that, or GPU compute or compute clusters, then go choose the high performance computing stream. That's it. It's as simple as that. So Chetan has a very interesting question, which is how AI can be used in power sector. Again, power sector could mean a huge number of things. There are some power grid companies, especially in Europe and US, also in East Asia, that try to predict power fluctuations and plan things accordingly. It's a simple time series forecasting problem, fairly simple and straightforward. But there are also some very interesting applications of it. For example, I know a startup from Ubiquitous Computing Group at University of Washington. What they've done here is they've created a simple plug point which you can plug it to any of the plugs in the home. It looks at the electromagnetic waveform and it predicts which devices are on, which devices are off by analyzing that electromagnetic waveforms. Right? So power sector could mean a lot of things. Like I've told you something which a startup did. I think this startup got acquired by Netgear, if I'm not wrong. This was a very interesting piece of research that I read a couple of years back. Or it could be like a large power company. In India, I don't know how much potential is there because I don't know how many power companies are actually deploying these statistical models, but I know a few European, East Asian companies, and also like in South Korea, in Japan, also in the US who do some of this. Cool. So this is Vamshi who says how to get into robotics and robotics companies from AI and ML. Vamshi, the problem is if you're in India, there are literally very, very few companies which work in robotics. Again, a big component of robotics, there is also mechanical engineering, electrical engineering, all of that, but there is typically computer vision related problems. So if you're planning to pursue a career in robotics, There are two broad areas that you have to be good at. One is certainly computer vision. The other is some amount of reinforcement learning. But there are literally a handful of really decent companies in India that are doing it. Right? If you're in the US, your scope is slightly better, but don't limit yourself to just one small domain, because that could limit the number of companies that you can apply for. I would say become a generalist first. If you're first getting into machine learning and data science, it's a good idea to be a generalist, because that will open up maximum doors. You can get into one of the companies, whether it's a computer vision role, NLP role, whether it's standard data analysis, whether it's tabular data, whether it's banking domain. Try and keep that open mind approach, because that will ensure that you will get into the field. Once you get into the field, then you can choose to specialize based on what opportunities exist for you, right? I would not recommend, again, if you're phenomenal, if you're super passionate about robotics, you might end up starting your own company. That's a different beast altogether, right? But in general, the number of robotics companies or organizations we see in India is literally a handful. So this is a question who says, please recommend some good books for beginners in deep learning or machine learning. Again, there are a huge number of books, but some of my favorite books are, you can see, again, some of these are slightly more theoretical. Unfortunately, most textbooks, most good mathematically oriented textbooks don't cover applications as much. But there is this book called Deep Learning by Ian Goodfellow and others. It's slightly outdated, but it gives you a strong foundation. Very nice book. Then there is Elements of Statistical Learning from a bunch of statisticians at Stanford. Very nice classic textbook. Lot of in-depth math, very little application stuff. Similarly, there are a bunch of good books from O'Reilly which discusses more about libraries like NumPy, SciPy, Scikit-learn, TensorFlow. Some of those O'Reilly publication books, they are good to learn the programming related stuff, but they lack on the mathematical depth. That's another problem. Then there is Pattern Recognition by Christopher Bishop. Very nice standard textbook used at many universities. Very good with mathematics, very low on applications. Right? So almost all the books have some trade-offs here and there. Okay, but these are some of the best books that I have come across. I have learned a lot myself from. So Yashwant says, I got placed in a data science startup as a fresher with 6.5 lakhs compensation. Should I continue with the company or with GATE? When you say GATE, I believe for GATE preparation. Right? You can prepare for GATE and still continue in the company, build your skills, become stronger. Like 6.5 is like on the lower end of the spectrum. That's okay. You're a fresher, so that's okay. Get into this role and build your skills over the next couple of years. Also prepare for GATE. You can do both of them. Why not? GATE gives you that breadth of knowledge on foundational computer science, and go from this 6.5 lakh compensation of the startup, grow within the startup if possible into, like, you can always double the compensation in like a couple of years comfortably. Or if you don't have enough scope to grow within the same organization, if you have the right skills, if you learn the mathematical depth, the breadth, do a bunch of good projects, end-to-end projects, deploy these projects on real-world systems, just use the free tier on many cloud-based systems to deploy these projects, and you can do a terrific job. Within a year or so, you can easily double in terms of compensation comfortably. Again, GATE preparation, I mean, if you want to pursue a master's degree, GATE is probably, to get into almost all the major universities in India, good universities, GATE is mandatory. So this is Manikant Dubey, who says, I have graduated from civil engineering in 2018. I want to do a career switch to ML and AI. How should I start? Should I start first learn the skills for data analyst role and directly enroll for the course? Again, either way is all right for you. We have a few students who come from the civil engineering, mechanical engineering background. So most likely, I don't know how much, I believe you have the 3 years experience and it's not a career break, but most likely a data analyst role or sometimes even a data scientist role is something that you might crack based on the skills that you build both in machine learning and programming. So either way you can pick, you can just call us otherwise and we can help you on that front. Cool. I'm just trying to see if there is any case that I did not handle and there are questions related to that. Just let me see if my team is also sending me some stuff. Cool. So Lokesh says, can we get a job in US or Europe after applied AI course as a fresher? Europe, we don't have a good network. In US, we certainly do. And if you have the work permit in the US, if you're residing in US, if you have the work permit, certainly we can help you. Even as a fresher, we can help you get into roles. But we cannot help you with respect to the H-1B or the equivalent visa processing. So Rohit had this question, which is, I have a master's degree in mathematics. To transition into data science, should I do some courses like applied AI course or a master's degree or a PhD program? Again, there are two different ways. You can go both the ways and still come out very well. Both these ways are valid. So typically, we have a lot of students who are pursuing their master's degree in India, including the top universities and also abroad. Many of them, at least the feedback that they have given us, is the machine learning that they learn at applied AI course is much more relevant to the industry than what they learn in most master's programs. And that's the reality of it. Again, one of the things when we started applied AI course a few years ago, we started because we saw that academia is not filling that gap. Or universities, even the top universities of the world, their curriculum is so stale. Their curriculum is so irrelevant to, again, I work with some of the top universities of India. I see their curriculum, literally, it no way is relevant in the context of real world machine learning that these folks will join. That's the unfortunate reality of it. But to be honest with you, there is no wrong path. You can either go through a program like applied AI course or any program of your choice, or you can go through master's degree. But make sure, if you're going through a master's degree, make sure you're learning the real world applied stuff, not some theoretical stuff that a professor fancies, which is no way used in the real world. Right? You have to make that you have to get that understanding very, very clearly. Cool. So this is from Amit Singh. I'm a second year undergraduate student doing BTech in AI. Is applied AI helpful for me? Very interesting question. So very nice question, because BTech in AI, I think a few universities started recently. So Amit, applied AI course will benefit you when you enter into the core machine learning, AI, data science topics. I believe I've seen some of the syllabi of these undergraduate AI programs. Typically in the first and second year, you learn basic computer science stuff. If you're learning that, applied AI course may not be more appropriate. I would still recommend, even if you're doing a BTech in AI, become good in data structures, algorithms, computer organization, operating systems, become really good at these things. In the first year and second year, become a good programmer. That's super duper important. And again, in your second year, if some of the core data science topics like probability statistics or data analysis, data visualization, or machine learning algorithms or data mining, if some of these subjects are starting, then you can certainly think of considering applied AI course. Again, please call us. Again, for some of these questions, we believe that giving you personal answers, you can just shoot an email to us or call us on the phone numbers listed, and we can certainly help you on that front, because these require us to answer very personal questions. Again, Amrit says, what is the average in-hand salary for a fresher for data science and machine learning roles? Very interesting question. Just like for software engineering roles, there is a huge spectrum. When you say average in-hand salary, your tax bracket depends on how much savings you have, what other loans you have, and things like that. So let's talk about not CTC, but gross salary. Gross salary is the money that you make, either in terms of stocks that you can sell, or in terms of cash, or in terms of monthly salary. You have to pay taxes on it. So the pre-tax salary that you can typically expect for a fresher ranges from 6 lakhs to 22 lakhs, typically for a fresher in India, right? Even if you're reasonably good, you can get into the 10 to 12 bracket. Getting into 22 is typically the FANG-like companies. The smaller services companies and or the smaller startups and services companies, typically they are in the 6 lakh bracket. The good ones are typically 10 to 12 lakh compensations. Again, again, we're trying to answer as many questions as possible. If there is something that we are not able to answer here, because there are a few hundred students who are attending this live session, if there is something that we are not able to answer, please feel free to email us. We will try and answer as many questions as you have via email, because that's easier, because we have a limited 90 minutes. We're already 80 minutes into this. So in general, before we wrap up this session, the most important thing is, the reason we are doing this specific session on transition paths is to give you a realistic picture of things. Because we have some students who say, hey, this is who I am, this is my education background, will I get into FANG company in 6 months? So there are some students who get in, but there is a vast majority of them typically go from, especially if you're not an expert programmer, if you're not an expert in data science, machine learning, there is a certain path that you can follow. So as you might have seen this in many of our interviews of students also, patience in the learning process, right? Again, remember, FANG companies, for every role they have, they get a few thousand applications. So they get to pick and choose whom they want to interview. And I've been an interviewer at a FANG company, right? And an interviewer cannot do more than 1 or 2 interviews a day. So they get to pick and choose whom they want to interview. And you have to stand out from the crowd, right? Why should a company give you time if you don't stand out in terms of your work or your expertise or your prior work or what you have done, right? So please try to think about it from the perspective of the company also. And also make sure that you have the right skills, right? So for example, so we have some students who say, hey, I only want to interview at FANG-like companies, nothing less. We do some mock interviews for them. We say, hey, here is a machine learning problem. And let's say you take a simple machine learning model with some objectives, some constraints, some mathematical formulation. We modify the problem slightly. And we say, let's solve this problem. And they can't. And that's the basic expectation, right? If you have first principles understanding of a concept like logistic regression or SVM, a small change in the formulation, you should be able to work it out again. That's a fundamental first principles thinking skill that is needed, right? And that's something that you have to think about, right? So most importantly, build the skills, be a little patient, you will get into the best of companies. I have worked with a lot of people who came from colleges whose names I don't know, at Amazon, across the world, not just in India, across the world. And these guys are phenomenal engineers, and they have been patient, they have been continuous learners, and their skills are phenomenally good, right? So that patience, that continuous learning, and going through the stages step by step, again, that's the reason why we are showing you these typical paths that people take, just to give you a realistic picture of how things work. Okay, thank you very much, folks. I'll wrap it up for today. Unfortunately, as you always know, it's impossible to answer all the questions that are there in the chat window. So please email us and we'll try and answer as many questions as we can. Thank you very much.